This is why you should never hitch a ride with random people. This is a cautionary hitchhiking story, and one that may make you think twice about going out on a blind date. This story is inspired by a true story that happened to someone, an unnerving creepypasta that I'll never forget. It haunts me to this day, all these years later. When I heard about this story, it was a horror story I wish I could forget. I've changed the names and the details so that this person doesn't find the one I'm about to tell you about and hunt them down. This is unlike any scary Reddit stories you've heard. It's creepy and it makes me worry that this guy I'll tell you about, if we could ever run into him again. I hope not, and you'll see why in a moment. Just a trigger alert. The story I'm about to tell you has some tension. It's between two people. It deals with things that are not for everyone to hear, so if you're a sensitive listener, you might want to turn it off. I promised myself that I wouldn't talk about what happened again when I first heard it. It gives me the creeps every time I think about it. But then again, if I can tell people everything that happened, maybe it will save somebody from having to deal with it too. This is hard, and it deals with things that you won't want to believe. Things I wish I didn't, but know are true. Okay, here we go. Like I said, this is a cautionary hitchhiking story, and one that may make you think twice about going out on a blind date. This scary story is about a girl named Angelica. She was in her late 20s, a pretty girl who deserved a much better life than she had. That night she was supposed to be going out on a simple blind date, nothing more than meeting a guy named Robert at a diner out of town. She'd never been to this part of town before, but her best friend had set them up, and Angelica was curious to see if the description matched reality. Blonde hair, charming smile. What could go wrong, right? Angelica had just been passed over for a promotion at the hospital where she worked, and her car had broken down, so she'd taken an Uber to the restaurant. She just needed something to go right in her life for once. She wondered if she was overdressed, wearing a dress a little tighter than she normally did. She'd made sure she'd chosen one that accentuated her curves, but still kept her classy. She'd even gotten a manicure done that day with French tips. She scratched her arm in nervousness. Maybe her senses were trying to warn her about something. Then again, the idea of meeting a great guy who her best friend had recommended seemed like just the change Angelica needed. The evening started with anticipation as she walked into the cozy diner. It wasn't too fancy, the perfect place for a first date, so if she had to ditch the place, it wouldn't be so bad. Ditch the place was something she'd wished she'd done as she thought back to this night. Meanwhile, Angelica waited a while at the restaurant, sitting at the bar, drumming her manicured fingernails, wondering if she'd been stood up. She wanted to text her friend, but the reception wasn't great in this part of town, and she wasn't too familiar with the area, so she figured she'd just tell her how it went afterwards. Angelica didn't expect anything from it. It probably would be another lame date like the others she'd been on lately. Now listen to the next details in this story because it's going to be important. Angelica was thinking about leaving when her eyes landed on a man in a corner booth. Blonde hair, good looking. Could this be Robert? He smiled, and Angelica approached, thinking she'd found her date. "Robert?" Angelica asked, tucking a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. The devilishly handsome man paused at first as if he was confused. Maybe he was nervous about this date like Angelica, but then he smiled. It disarmed her, something Angelica would live to regret. His grin widened, and he nodded. "Robert, yeah, that's me." They ordered their food, something light since she didn't know where this evening was headed, but then they started talking. His voice was like milk and honey, relaxing her. As the evening wore on, the night getting later and darker, the conversation flowed, seemingly innocent, but there was something off about him. A certain intensity in his eyes. Maybe Angelica liked bad boys. She wondered if he was this passionate in bed. She couldn't help herself. He was so handsome, and Angelica guessed she overlooked some obvious red flags. They ordered a couple of drinks, some dark red wine, and Angelica stepped into the restroom to freshen up. Something she never should have done, but how could she have known? She was so excited maybe her luck had turned for the better, or so she thought. As the evening progressed, They laughed and sipped on their drinks. It fizzed a little, tickling her upper lip. Hers tasted a little funny, and he said that if Angelica didn't like the drinks here, he knew a better place. The restaurant was cheap, and she wasn't surprised. The drinks weren't all that great. Besides, this Robert character smiled that million-dollar smile and invited her to his car, saying he had a great collection of wine at his place. He had a gorgeous, shiny black Mercedes, and even in the evening, it glittered, dark tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. How mysterious. Robert was much taller and bigger when he stood up. He had a ruggedly handsome look in the shadows of the evening as the street light above shone on it, the biting bugs buzzing around it. Robert even opened the car door for Angelica, and she guessed it had been so long since she'd met a gentleman, she never should have done it. As they got into the car, he switched on soft jazz music that filled the air, calming Angelica's nerves even more. The jazz music continued in the background, soothing, reassuring, hypnotic even. The car had a scent to it, one that Angelica recognized having worked in a hospital, but even then she couldn't quite pin down until later. It was the same scent of fear mixed with the stench of a blood bank. Angelica looked back and saw a little girl's doll on the floor behind the driver's seat. She thought that was a little strange. He hadn't said he was a father, and that's not all he didn't tell her. "You have a kid?" He looked at Angelica as if he was caught doing something wrong. "Huh? No. Angelica wanted to ask him why he had the doll in the back then, but she guessed she felt she was intruding. Maybe she was being too nosy, but it bothered her that he'd hide something like that, or worse yet, that he'd lied to her. Angelica tried to push it aside. She wasn't looking to get into a relationship. She just needed someone to take her mind off her problems. And one night of passion with this devilishly handsome man was just what the doctor ordered. But in a bit, that would be the least of her problems. In the dim light, she noticed the tan line on where his ring finger was. Was he married and cheating on his wife? Again, she pushed the thoughts away, but one thing after another was making her regret this evening. But there was one thing Angelica did notice that made her pause more than anything. As Robert sped along the road was something very strange. Dried blood flakes under his fingernails. Her heart raced, but Angelica tried to convince herself it was just her imagination running wild. Besides, she was feeling a little drunk, which was weird because she'd hardly had any of the drink. The lonely road they whizzed past with increasing speed was dizzying. Her body swayed and violently bumped from side to side as he swerved, and she thought about asking him to slow down, but Angelica's head was spinning. She tried to roll down the window to get a little air when she realized the window and the door were locked. Angelica looked at Robert. His charm had melted away. He looked intense again. "It's a little hot," she heard herself say, though her words were slurring. He ignored Angelica, and that should have been the first sign something was definitely wrong. Angelica intuitively reached for her phone, feeling it buzzing against her small purse. There was a notification on her phone, the message from her best friend. "Hey, where are you?" Angelica chuckled and quickly texted her, "With Robert, a little drunk." "What are you doing?" he asked accusatorily. "Oh, nothing, just letting my—" "It's rude," he said curtly, and she felt like she was being scolded and put the phone back. "You do this a lot, meeting up with strangers." No, Fucking liar," he said under his breath. "Karma's real, you know. Liars in the end get what they deserve." The comment was unnerving to Angelica. Where was the nice guy that she'd met up with at the bar? She was a little upset that her best friend had set her up with someone like him. Where were all the nice guys at? She sighed, but not too audibly. He seemed on edge, and the last thing she wanted was to set it off. She thought about telling him she had a headache and asking him to drop her off at home or even back at the cafe. Angelica told herself she was just overthinking it. Maybe she was being rude and she didn't want to hurt his feelings. But then her friend responded with something Angelica would never forget. "Robert said you never showed. He's still at the diner." She was confused until it dawned on her. Fear gripped Angelica, and she reached for her phone. Who was this guy? He wasn't Robert. He'd lied to her. And where he was taking her, Angelica didn't know. Panic surged through Angelica as she realized she was trapped. Her throat tightened, her jaw clenched, and she could feel the subtle drip of sweat from the pit of her arm making its way down her side. She tried to open the car door again, but it was locked. "Let me out," Angelica forced herself to say, but he turned up the music, switching it from smooth jazz to heavy metal to drown out her pleas. The music that had been comforting before now felt like a cruel joke, a soundtrack to Angelica's impending doom. "I said let me out of this car," she said. "Shut the fuck up," he said, his voice gritty and dark. "Or I'll give you something to scream about. You're going nowhere until I'm done with you." What the hell did he have planned for her? If the dried blood on his fingernails or the little girl's doll in the back had any indication, he was up to no good. He'd probably killed that little girl, was driving her out to wherever he dumped her body. Angelica tried to covertly look at her phone. There had to be a way to text her friend. And then, in the midst of her drugged haze, Angelica saw it. Another message from her friend, the lifeline she desperately needed. "He's not Robert. Get out now!" Before Angelica could say anything, before she could react, the foul man snatched her phone, rolled down his window just enough to toss it out. "You won't be needing that where we're going," he said matter-of-factly. With a surge of adrenaline, Angelica fought against the pull of sleep. It finally dawned on her that when she'd gone to the restroom to freshen up, he'd spiked her drink so she'd have no chance against him. Angelica felt so stupid. She'd allowed her desperation to be with someone to ignore her intuition, and she'd pay with her life for that choice. She was going to die this young, never having found true love, never having lived the life she could have lived. Angelica had to get out, had to escape this nightmare. She struggled to unlock the car door, her fingers fumbling, but the locks held fast. Tears blurred Angelica's vision as she pounded on the window, her voice a feeble cry for help, hoping each occasional car they passed by would see her. But then again, the tinted windows and the blasting hard metal made that impossible. He just smiled, a sickening grin that sent chills down her spine. "You're pathetic, stupid bitch." The world spun around Angelica, her consciousness slipping away. As darkness closed in, she knew she was in the clutches of a true nightmare, trapped with a monster who wore a smile as his mask. Angelica felt the edges of her consciousness blurring, the drugs in her system trying to drag her into a dark abyss. But she had one last card to play. As the faux Robert sitting next to her grinned like he'd won the lottery, she let her body slump slightly, feigning defeat. Her eyes cut a quick glance to his face, checking his reaction. He relaxed, mistaking her movement for the drug finally kicking in. And that was the opening Angelica needed. Weapon. She needed a weapon, but there was nothing. But the tight rope she saw a glimpse of lodged under his seat. She needed something, anything. Then it dawned on her. She used what she had, her nails honed to a sharp edge. Angelica lunged at him, targeting his eyes with a speed he didn't expect from someone supposedly drugged. Her fingernails dug deep, penetrating the soft, vulnerable orbs. He screamed, a terrible, high-pitched wail that filled the car. His foot, in a spasm of pain and surprise, stomped on the brake. They skidded violently to a stop, and Angelica used that moment to reach over to his side and unlock the car door. She tumbled out, her heart pounding in her chest like a frantic drumbeat. Angelica was still groggy, but adrenaline was now coursing through her veins, offsetting the effects of the drug. Ignoring the pain in her heels, Angelica ran for her life. She saw a tree line up ahead and darted for it, praying it would offer some form of concealment. She knew she needed to disable him, not just outrun him. Angelica was searching the ground for anything she could use when she heard the car moving slowly down the road, and as the car inched closer, Angelica felt her heart in her mouth. She needed to act, and fast. Angelica saw a sizable rock and grabbed it, clutching it like a lifeline. As the car passed her hiding spot, she lunged out and threw the rock with all the force she could muster. The rock collided with the windshield, spiderwebbing the glass and momentarily blinding him. Angelica used those precious seconds to run to the driver's side, reached in through the open window, and aimed for his already injured eyes with her sharpened nails once again. He screamed and, in that moment, dropped what looked like a taser. Seizing the opportunity, Angelica picked it up and turned it on him. He convulsed, electricity surging through him, disabling him long enough for Angelica to drag him out of the car and dump him on the lonely road. Angelica slid into the driver's seat, her hands shaking. She revved the engine and sped away, leaving him writhing in her rearview mirror, a lump of defeated malevolence on a dark, deserted road. As Angelica disappeared into the night, she felt the last of the drug's effects wear off, replaced by a rush of triumph, freedom, and the will to live another day.